For nearly 3 decades, he stood just a few feet from one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, holding down the low end while the world watched someone else take the spotlight. He never asked for the attention. He just wanted to play. But underneath the bright lights and the platinum records, something else was happening, a slow, quiet erosion of trust, of credit, and of respect. Now in his 70s, Michael Anthony is finally connecting the dots out loud, and what he's described paints a very different picture of Van Halen than the one most fans grew up believing. This is the story of the bassist who helped build a legend, and the long, painful road that led him to finally speak his truth. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand how deep this story runs, you have to understand who Michael Anthony was before he ever picked up a bass guitar. He was born Michael Sobolewski, and music was already running through his family's blood long before Van Halen existed. His father, Walter, played the trumpet, and young Michael grew up listening to him practice and perform around the house. That early exposure to live music planted something in him. It wasn't just background noise, it was a window into a world he wanted to be part of. Like his father, Michael started out on trumpet. He stuck with it through his school years, eventually joining the marching band after his family moved to Southern California in the mid-1960s. He attended Dana Junior High in Arcadia, and band practice became a regular part of his life. It taught him discipline, timing, and what it meant to play as part of something bigger than himself, lessons that would matter more than he could have known. But around age 13, something shifted. Michael wanted to be different. Everyone around him wanted to play guitar or drums, the flashy instruments, the ones that got noticed. So he went the other way. A friend named Mike Hershey lent him a Fender Mustang guitar, and Michael did something pretty resourceful for a teenager. He pulled 2 strings off it and turned it into a makeshift bass. That hack job became his first real instrument, and it lit a fire in him that never really went out. His father noticed the dedication. Once he saw how serious Michael was getting, he bought him a real Fender Precision bass and a Gibson amp, proper gear for a kid who was clearly not just messing around. That gift mattered more than it might seem. In a lot of working-class households in that era, spending real money on a kid's hobby wasn't a given. Walter Sobolewski was effectively telling his son, without saying it outright, that he saw something worth investing in. From there, Michael started studying the greats. Jack Bruce from Cream. John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin. Harvey Brooks from Electric Flag. These were the players who shaped his ear and his approach to the instrument. He wasn't chasing flash or trying to be the flashiest player in the room. These were musicians known for serving the song, for locking in with the drummer and making everything around them sound bigger and tighter. That's a very specific kind of musical philosophy, and it's one that would define his entire career. The bass isn't always the instrument that gets the magazine covers, but it's almost always the instrument holding the whole structure up, and Michael seemed to understand that instinctively, even as a teenager. And here's a small detail that says a lot about who he is. Michael is naturally left-handed, but he taught himself to play bass right-handed anyway, simply because right-handed instruments were what was available and what everyone around him was using. He didn't make a fuss about it or ask for a special setup. He just adapted and made it work. That kind of quiet adaptability would end up defining his whole career, long before anyone in Van Halen ever knew his name. It's almost a small preview of the man's whole story, someone willing to bend himself around a situation rather than demand the situation bend around him. By the early 70s, Michael was deep into the Southern California music scene, playing in local bands around Pasadena and Arcadia. The one that stuck was called Snake, a power trio mixing hard rock with blues, where Michael played bass and also handled lead vocals. They weren't famous. They were grinding it out at school dances, local clubs, and small festivals, building chops and confidence one gig at a time. It was unglamorous work, but it was exactly the kind of work that builds a musician who can handle anything. And it was through this same local circuit that Fate started doing its thing. There was another up-and-coming band in the area called Mammoth, fronted by 2 brothers, Eddie and Alex Van Halen. Their paths crossed more than once, and on one particular night, Snake actually opened for Mammoth at Pasadena High School. During the show, Mammoth's sound system broke down. Instead of standing back and letting the night fall apart, Michael offered up Snake's own equipment so the show could go on. It was a small, generous gesture, but it left a mark on Eddie and Alex. They remembered it. Not long after, Mammoth lost their bassist, Mark Stone, and suddenly there was an opening. The Van Halen brothers thought of the guy who'd bailed them out that night and invited him to a jam session in a garage to see if there was real chemistry. There was. Michael's aggressive, locked-in bass style and his strong, high-harmony vocals gave the band something new, a fuller, richer sound they hadn't had before. The Van Halen brothers didn't hesitate. Michael was in. Soon after, the band changed its name from Mammoth to Van Halen, since another group was already using that name. With David Lee Roth on vocals, Eddie on guitar, Alex on drums, and Michael on bass, the classic lineup was complete. For Michael, this wasn't just joining a band. It was the start of a completely different life. As the band toured through the Los Angeles club circuit, places like Gazzarri's and the Whiskey A Go Go, Michael's role became unmistakable. His soaring backing vocals gave Roth's lead vocals something to bounce off of, creating that signature Van Halen vocal blend fans still recognize instantly today. And underneath all of Eddie's explosive guitar work and Alex's pounding drums, it was Michael's steady, no-nonsense bass playing holding the whole thing together. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. He was the floor everyone else danced on. When Van Halen's debut album dropped in 1978, you could hear exactly what he brought to the table. Songs like Runnin' with the Devil and Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love relied on his steady rhythmic foundation, while his vocal harmonies lifted tracks like Jamie's Cryin' and Feel Your Love Tonight into something more anthemic. The album exploded, and critics specifically praised the band's vocal blend. Michael's contribution to that signature sound was undeniable. As the band's fame snowballed and the tours got bigger, Michael earned a quiet reputation within the group. He was the dependable one. The low-drama one. While other members clashed and competed, Michael just kept showing up and doing the work. In the early years, that work came with real ownership. According to former Van Halen manager Noel Monk, Michael was treated as an equal partner financially, responsible for 20% of the band's debts and entitled to 20% of the revenue, with a real voice in band decisions. He wasn't a hired gun. He was a full member, by every measure that mattered. But as the band's success grew, so did the internal power struggles, and slowly, the financial structure started shifting in favor of the Van Halen brothers and Roth. Michael's share didn't just stay flat, it started eroding. Through all of it, he kept his head down and kept playing. Through the rest of the 70s and into the 80s, as the band racked up multi-platinum album after multi-platinum album, Michael's playing never wavered. By the time Fair Warning and Diver Down came out, he was a foundational piece of the band's sound, both in the studio and on stage. Eddie got the guitar hero glory. Roth got the charisma headlines. But anyone paying close attention could see Michael was the glue. Then came 1984, the year everything changed, in more ways than one. The album simply titled 1984 turned Van Halen into a global phenomenon. Jump, Panama, Hot for Teacher. These weren't just hits, they were cultural moments, songs that defined an entire era of rock radio. But while the band's commercial success hit its peak, something much darker was happening behind the scenes, and it would haunt Michael Anthony for the rest of his life. According to Noel Monk's memoir, during the tour for that very album, Michael was confronted by Eddie, Alex, and David Lee Roth and pressured to sign away his future songwriting credits and royalties. Monk's account is hard to read without feeling for the guy. He describes Michael being handed the contract backstage, just hours before a show, with all three of his bandmates standing over him as he signed. There was no time to think it over. No lawyer brought in to look it over first. Just pressure, in the moment, before a concert he had to go out and perform. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. This wasn't a quiet conversation in a manager's office with time to sleep on it. This was four guys who'd spent years together on the road, who'd shared hotel rooms and tour buses, and the kind of exhausting grind that only a touring rock band really understands, turning into something closer to an ambush. Whatever you think about the business side of the music industry, there's something uniquely uncomfortable about being cornered by the same people you trust your safety with on stage every night, just hours before you have to go out and perform alongside them like nothing happened. And here's the part that makes it even worse: the contract was retroactive. That means Michael didn't just lose future songwriting credit. He lost his stake in 1984 itself, an album he had already poured his voice and his bass lines into. Monk has said he would have advised Michael against signing if he'd known about it in time. But Michael went ahead and signed anyway, reportedly because he didn't want to cause a scene or put the tour at risk. He chose the band over himself, in the moment that maybe mattered more than any other moment in his career. The financial fallout from that decision was staggering, and it didn't show up all at once, it bled out over decades. 1984 alone went on to sell more than 10 million copies in the United States. Add in box sets, greatest hits compilations, reissues, licensing deals. Every time Van Halen's classic catalog got repackaged and resold, Michael got nothing extra for songs he helped create. He wasn't just losing money. He was being slowly written out of the band's legal history, even while he kept showing up to play the same songs night after night. For years, Michael said almost nothing publicly about it. He carried it quietly, kept being professional, and avoided dragging his bandmates through the press. When he finally did open up about it, in interviews and fan Q&As much later, he confirmed that he'd signed under pressure, and admitted it still stung. But he also said something that tells you everything about who he is. He said keeping the band together was what mattered most to him. He just wanted to keep playing music. That was the whole goal. And it's almost heartbreaking, looking back, how much that loyalty cost him. If the 1984 contract was the financial wound, what came next was the personal one, and in some ways, it cut even deeper. As the years rolled on, Eddie Van Halen started talking about Michael differently in interviews. Not as a steady, dependable bandmate, but as someone who supposedly needed to be taught how to do his job. The most damaging moment came in a 2015 Billboard interview, where Eddie flatly said he'd had to show Michael how to play every note, and suggested he lacked initiative as a musician. He didn't stop there, he also took shots at Michael's singing, dismissing the vocal blend that fans had praised for decades as something that was mostly Eddie's voice anyway. Fans and fellow musicians didn't buy it, and they said so. The backlash was swift, because the claim didn't line up with what people had actually witnessed for almost 30 years, a bassist who anchored some of the most demanding live shows in rock history, night after night, tour after tour. There's a basic logic problem with the claim, too, and plenty of fans pointed it out at the time. If Michael genuinely needed every single note spelled out for him, it's hard to square that with 3 decades of consistent, professional, technically sound performances across dozens of albums and hundreds of shows, recorded and filmed for the world to see. Talent that thin doesn't survive 30 years on arena stages. Michael eventually responded directly, saying the criticism simply wasn't true. He explained that he always learned the band's material on his own, and that there was never a single instance of Eddie sitting him down to teach him a part. He pointed out, reasonably, that if those moments had really happened the way Eddie described, there'd be some record of it somewhere, rehearsal footage, a tour manager's recollection, a fellow bandmate backing up the story. There wasn't. He wasn't combative about it. He didn't go on a press tour to tear Eddie down in return. He just calmly laid out his side and let people draw their own conclusions, which in itself tells you something about the contrast between the two men's public personas. But here's the thing about public insults from someone you've known for decades: they don't just damage your reputation, they damage you. Michael has talked about how much those comments hurt, specifically because they came from someone he'd once considered a true creative partner, someone he'd spent his whole adult life trying to support. He's described the experience as emotionally draining, made worse by the fact that he'd spent years trying to keep the peace inside a band that was constantly on the edge of falling apart. There's a particular kind of pain in being publicly diminished by someone whose career you helped build alongside your own. it's not just an insult, it's a rewriting of history that you watched happen in real time, powerless to stop it. And the gap between them just kept widening. By the mid-2000s, communication between Michael and Eddie had basically stopped. Michael found himself slowly pushed out of decisions that used to include him. After Eddie passed away in 2020, Michael spoke about how much he regretted that the rift was never mended. He'd hoped, somewhere down the line, there would be a moment to sit down, clear the air, and find some kind of closure. That moment never came. And now it never will. It's one of those situations that sits as a quiet warning about what ego and unspoken resentment can do to even the strongest creative bonds, two people who built something incredible together, separated by silence at the very end. While all this tension was simmering in public, something quieter, and arguably crueler, was happening behind the scenes. Michael was slowly being phased out of the band, piece by piece, without ever being told directly. It started showing up in small ways. During the recording of 1998's Van Halen 3, Michael only played bass on 3 of the 11 tracks. Eddie handled bass duties on the rest. At the time, it might have seemed like a creative choice, a one-off. But looking back, it reads more like the first crack in the foundation. Michael kept touring with the band, kept showing up in promotional photos and interviews, but his actual presence on the records was shrinking. That pattern continued into the 2000s. When Van Halen released the compilation, The Best of Both Worlds, in 2004, which included 3 new studio tracks, Michael's only contribution was backing vocals. He didn't play bass on any of them. To fans paying close attention, it was becoming obvious that his role inside the band had quietly shrunk down to almost nothing, even as the Van Halen brothers tightened their grip on every musical and business decision the band made. His final tour with the band came in 2004, the heavily publicized reunion with Sammy Hagar. But even getting onto that tour came with a price. According to Hagar, Michael had to accept reduced pay and sign on as essentially a hired musician rather than a full, equal band member, a massive step down from where he'd started in the 70s. The tour itself did well commercially, but it didn't heal anything underneath the surface. Michael later said he just wanted to stay professional and move forward, but the signs were everywhere that the band no longer saw him as part of its long-term future. Then came 2006, and the final blow. Eddie decided to bring in his teenage son, Wolfgang Van Halen, as the band's new bassist, replacing Michael outright. Here's the part that still stings the most when you hear Michael describe it: he didn't get a phone call. He didn't get a heads up, a conversation, anything. He found out the way fans did, through rumors and what he read online. After more than 30 years of loyalty, of showing up, of carrying bass lines through some of the most chaotic stretches in the band's history, there wasn't even a courtesy call to tell him his time in the band was over. It wasn't framed as a decision he was part of. It was simply done to him. That's the moment that, more than any contract dispute or harsh quote in a magazine, really defines the quieter tragedy of Michael Anthony's story. He didn't get fired in any dramatic sense. He just got erased, a little at a time, until one day he read on the internet that his entire career with the band was over. So what do you do after almost 3 decades of loyalty ends in silence? If you're Michael Anthony, you go find people who actually value what you bring to the table, and as it turns out, there were plenty of them waiting. His friendship with Sammy Hagar, forged during the so-called Van Hagar years, turned out to be one of the most important relationships of his post-Van Halen life. In 2005, the two launched a touring act called The Other Half, playing Van Halen songs from both the Roth and Hagar eras. The name was a clever bit of self-awareness, a nod to the fact that both of them had spent years being treated as the lesser-known halves of the band, even while helping define its sound. Fans loved it, because it felt honest in a way the actual band sometimes hadn't been. A few years before that, in 2002, Michael and Sammy had also teamed up for a short-lived supergroup called Planet Us, alongside guitar virtuoso Joe Satriani and drummer Dean Castronovo, with Journey's Neil Schon involved at one point too. They never released a full album, but a couple of tracks they recorded eventually showed up on one of Hagar's solo records. It was a glimpse of just how respected Michael was among elite musicians, completely separate from the Van Halen name. But the real high point of his post-Van Halen career came in 2008, when he formed Chickenfoot, once again with Sammy Hagar, plus Joe Satriani on guitar and Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Chad Smith. Their debut album in 2009 cracked the top 10 on the Billboard 200, and the reviews were genuinely strong. This wasn't a nostalgia act riding on old fame. People recognized real chemistry and real musicianship. Their second album in 2011 only reinforced that this band had staying power, not just leftover goodwill. For Michael, Chickenfoot must have felt like a kind of vindication. Here he was, in his 50s, playing alongside three other genuinely world-class musicians who valued exactly what he brought to a band: steady low-end, strong vocal harmonies, and decades of stage experience that you simply cannot fake. Nobody in that lineup was telling him how to play his own instrument. In 2014, Michael and Sammy linked up again, this time forming Sammy Hagar and the Circle with guitarist Vic Johnson and drummer Jason Bonham, yes, the son of Led Zeppelin's John Bonham. The Circle leaned heavily into classic rock nostalgia, playing Van Halen, Zeppelin, Montrose, and Hagar's solo material live, but they also wrote original music. Their 2019 album, Space Between, hit number 4 on the Billboard 200, proof that audiences still wanted to hear what Michael Anthony had to offer, decades after his name first showed up on a Van Halen record. Watching Michael in the Circle, fans got something they'd been denied for years inside Van Halen itself, a band where he was treated as an equal, where his contributions were acknowledged out loud, on stage and in interviews, instead of quietly assumed or quietly erased. Across all of these projects, one thing becomes really clear: Michael Anthony's value was never in question to the people who actually played music with him. It was only ever in question inside Van Halen itself. Every single collaborator he worked with after leaving the band, Hagar, Satriani, Chad Smith, Jason Bonham, has spoken about him with genuine respect, both as a musician and as a person to be around on the road. That's not nothing. In an industry full of inflated egos and short memories, having that kind of universal goodwill from people who've actually shared a stage with you says more than any single magazine quote ever could. Eddie Van Halen's death in 2020 should have, in theory, opened the door to some kind of healing. Instead, it exposed just how fractured this family of musicians really was. In the years after Eddie passed, talk of a tribute tour started picking up steam, reportedly with Alex Van Halen reaching out to former members and collaborators, including Michael and David Lee Roth, to gauge interest. Joe Satriani was even brought into early conversations as a possible guitarist for the project. By most accounts, Michael's involvement was seen as essential to making any tribute feel authentic. But it fell apart. Reportedly, Roth resisted certain aspects of how the tribute was being shaped, unwilling to take part in something built so explicitly around honoring Eddie's memory in the format the rest of the group wanted. That created friction that never really got resolved. On top of that, Alex Van Halen's health became a serious complication. A back injury in 2022 made a physically demanding tour increasingly unrealistic for him. With Roth backing away and Alex sidelined, two of the most essential pieces of any reunion were simply gone. Michael has confirmed he was contacted about the project and was genuinely interested in being part of it. But the emotional and logistical obstacles were too big to overcome, and the tribute tour quietly died before it ever really got off the ground. For Michael, it meant losing what might have been his last realistic shot at some kind of full-circle closure with the band and with Eddie's memory. He had, by his own account, repaired some of his relationship with Wolfgang. But the bigger, harder rifts, with Roth, with Alex, stayed open. Fans who'd hoped for one last moment with the classic lineup, or even some version of it, were left with nothing but the silence where that moment should have been. It's worth pausing on just how rare that kind of ending is in rock history. Plenty of legendary bands eventually patch things up for one last tour, one last photo, one last bow before the lights go down for good, even bands with histories far uglier than Van Halen's. The fact that this group, with so much shared history and so much unfinished business, couldn't manage even one final symbolic gesture says something about how deep the wounds really went. It wasn't really about logistics or scheduling in the end. It was about people who had spent decades building walls between each other and running out of time to tear them back down. So where does that leave Michael Anthony today, looking back at all of it from his 70s? Not bitter, by most accounts, but clear-eyed. He's spoken about getting a measure of personal closure in other ways, including reconnecting with Wolfgang and attending his shows with Mammoth WVH. He stayed musically active through Hagar's various projects, still playing the bass lines and singing the harmonies that defined an era of rock music, even if the band that made him famous never gave him the credit, the money, or the conversation he deserved. What makes Michael Anthony's story land so hard isn't a single explosive moment. It's the accumulation, a contract signed under pressure backstage, a public insult from an old friend that didn't match the truth, a slow fade out of the studio, and finally, a phone call that never came. Through all of it, he kept playing. He kept showing up. And only now, decades later, has he been willing to lay out, piece by piece, just how much loyalty actually cost him. There's also something worth sitting with here about how differently the same story can look depending on who's telling it. For years, the public narrative around Van Halen centered almost entirely on Eddie's guitar genius and David Lee Roth's larger-than-life showmanship, with Michael reduced to a footnote, the quiet guy in the back who sang the high parts. It took him speaking candidly, late in life, for a fuller picture to really take shape, not a guy who lacked talent or ambition, but a guy who consistently chose the stability of the group over his own credit, his own money, and eventually his own seat in the band. That's not a small thing to give up, even if it never made headlines the way a guitar solo did. It's a familiar story in rock and roll, but rarely told this honestly, the guy who held the whole thing together rhythmically and vocally, who never demanded the spotlight, ending up with the least say in how his own story got written. Michael Anthony built Van Halen's sound right alongside Eddie, Alex, and David Lee Roth. He just had to wait until he was 70 years old to make sure people understood exactly how that story really went, not as a bitter takedown, but as a plain, overdue accounting of the truth. Thanks for watching. If this deep dive into Michael Anthony's story hit you the way it hit us, drop a comment and let us know what part stuck with you the most. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more honest looks at the stories behind rock's biggest legends. And if you want to keep going, there's another video waiting for you right now. Just click through and keep the music playing.